You're lying there in the dark right now. Maybe you cried earlier today. Maybe it was weeks ago. Maybe you're the kind of person who never cries or thinks you never do until suddenly you do, and it catches you completely off guard. That tightness in your throat, the heat behind your eyes, and then, if you let it happen, the tears come. They roll down your face. Your vision blurs. Your breathing changes. You might sob or stay silent, but the tears keep flowing. It's one of the most human things you can do. And here's what's strange. As far as we can tell, you are the only creature on Earth who does this. Not just the only primate, not just the only mammal, the only animal, period, that cries emotional tears. Think about that for a second. Of all the thousands of traits we share with other animals, breathing, bleeding, hunting, playing, mourning, fighting, loving, this one thing appears to be ours alone. Dogs howl in distress. Elephants trumpet and gather around their dead. Whales sing songs of loss across entire oceans. But visible tears streaming down the face purely because of what you're feeling inside? As far as current evidence shows, that's a human invention. If you're settling into sleep, go ahead and subscribe if you haven't. And drop a comment. Tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I love seeing them. Tokyo at dawn, Seattle at midnight, London during lunch. All of us here together thinking about tears in the dark. Scientists have been puzzling over this for decades. Systematic surveys of veterinarians and zookeepers, people who spend their entire lives around animals in distress, came back with the same answer again and again. No reliable observations of emotional weeping. Not in dogs, not in cats, not in apes, not in elephants. Plenty of animals produce tears. Every mammal, most birds, even reptiles have tear glands. Crocodiles famously weep while they eat, which is where we get the phrase crocodile tears. But those tears are just lubrication, salt excretion, eye maintenance, not emotion, not grief or joy or overwhelm. Human crying is different. It's not just tears. It's the whole system lighting up at once. Your brain processes the emotion. Your breathing changes, that characteristic hitching, sobbing pattern. Your face contorts in ways other people instantly recognize. And your lacrimal glands, those little tear factories above your eyes, switch on and flood your face with liquid. All of this together, synchronized, visible, unmistakable. No other animal does this full performance. So why do we? That's the question we're going to chase through this whole journey. We'll dig into the biology of your tear glands and the 3 completely different kinds of tears your eyes produce. We'll investigate whether animals really do cry, sorting through viral videos and crocodile skulls and some very intriguing recent hints about dogs and oxytocin. We'll travel back to ancient Greek funeral rites where weeping was a sacred duty, and forward to the neuroscience labs trying to figure out what actually happens in your brain when you break down. We'll explore the chemistry of tears themselves, whether they really do carry stress hormones out of your body like some researchers claim, and why a good cry can leave you feeling wrung out and strangely peaceful at the same time. This is a story about what makes us human, and it starts with salt water rolling down your face in the dark. Right now, as you're listening to this, there's a thin film of liquid coating your eyes. You can't feel it. You probably haven't thought about it all day. But it's there, about 3 micrometers thick, constantly refreshing itself, protecting your corneas from drying out, providing nutrients, fighting off bacteria. These are your basal tears, the maintenance crew, working every second of every day to keep your eyes functional. Your body produces about 1 to 2 microliters of this fluid every minute. That doesn't sound like much, but over the course of a day it adds up to enough liquid to fill a small shot glass. All of it spread across your eyes in an incredibly sophisticated 3-layer system. There's a mucin layer right against the cornea, anchoring everything in place. Then comes the aqueous layer, the main body of fluid, full of proteins and antimicrobial compounds, and on top, a thin lipid layer, basically a microscopic oil slick that stops the whole thing from evaporating. This system isn't uniquely human. Every mammal has it. Birds have it. Even reptiles produce something similar. Your dog's eyes are coated in essentially the same tear film you have right now. So are the eyes of a sparrow, a crocodile, a whale. It's ancient technology, refined over hundreds of millions of years of evolution. The basal tear film is so effective at what it does that nature basically never bothered changing it. If you could zoom in close enough to compare your tears to a bird's tears under a microscope, you'd see remarkably similar structures, same lipid layer, same aqueous proteins, same basic job, keep the eye clear and healthy. Then there are reflex tears. You know these intimately even if you've never thought about what to call them. The flood that hits when you're chopping onions, the stinging rush when dust blows in your eye, the streaming that happens in a cold wind. These tears are emergency response. Something irritates your cornea or conjunctiva. Sensory nerves fire off alarm signals through the trigeminal pathway, and your lacrimal glands switch into overdrive. Within seconds, you're producing tears at maybe 10 or 20 times the normal rate, trying to flush out whatever's bothering you. Reflex tears are basically just basal tears on high volume. They're composed of the same aqueous fluid, though the protein concentration can shift a bit because you're producing so much so fast. The function is obvious. Something threatens the eye, wash it out immediately. Every animal with tear glands can do this. It's straightforward protective biology. Irritant comes in, tears flush it out, problem solved. Evolution loves elegant solutions like that. But then there's the third kind, emotional tears, psychogenic tears, tears that have absolutely nothing to do with eye irritation or lubrication, and everything to do with what's happening inside your head. These are the tears that puzzle scientists, because they don't fit the pattern. They're produced when your limbic system, the emotional centers of your brain, particularly your hypothalamus, activate the same lacrimal glands that produce basal and reflex tears. But the trigger isn't physical. It's grief, joy, frustration, awe, overwhelming beauty. Physical pain, yes, but also emotional pain, the kind that doesn't touch your cornea at all. And here's where things get really interesting. Recent research suggests emotional tears aren't just the same fluid produced for different reasons. They might actually be chemically distinct. A pilot study using modern proteomic analysis found 52 proteins significantly enriched in emotional tears compared to conventionally stimulated tears. Many of them related to immune function and defense. The tears you cry when you're heartbroken might literally be different molecules than the tears you cry when you chop an onion. This echoes earlier work by biochemist William Frey back in the 1980s. Frey collected tears from volunteers, emotional tears from people watching sad films, and reflex tears from people exposed to onion vapors. He found that emotional tears had about 21% higher protein concentration. They also contained elevated levels of prolactin, a hormone involved in caregiving and bonding, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which your body releases during stress, and leucine and kephalin, an opioid peptide related to pain modulation. Frey proposed that emotional crying might be a way to literally excrete stress chemicals from your body, that tears might be, in some sense, detoxifying. It was a compelling idea. But here's the catch. Those findings haven't been robustly replicated. Later researchers, including crying specialist Advinger Hoots, note that we still don't have solid confirmation of Frey's specific hormonal claims. The biochemistry of emotional tears remains intriguing but provisional, more a mystery than a solved case. So we're left with this puzzle. Basal tears have an obvious function. Reflex tears have an obvious function. But emotional tears? Tears that blur your vision, increase your vulnerability, and happen specifically when you're already in distress. What possible survival advantage could those provide? That question is going to follow us through the rest of this journey. But first, we need to ask something even more basic. Are we really the only ones who do this? Let's start with a story that medieval travellers love to repeat. There's a creature, they said, that lurks in rivers and marshes. It's massive, ancient, utterly ruthless, and when it catches its prey, when it drags some unfortunate victim into the water and begins tearing flesh from bone, it weeps. Great tears stream down its scaled face as it devours its meal. Not tears of remorse, mind you, just tears, mechanical, meaningless, the perfect symbol of false grief, the crocodile. By 1563, crocodile tears had become fixed in English as a phrase meaning insincere sorrow, hypocritical grief, the performance of emotion without the substance. The image was older still. Late antique texts mention it. Medieval bestiaries illustrated it. But it was the 14th century travel narrative attributed to Sir John Mandeville that really cemented the legend for European readers. Mandeville described crocodiles that slay men, and they eaten hem weeping. They slay men and eat them weeping. Preachers loved this. Here was the perfect metaphor for false repentance, for going through the motions of grief while your heart remained cold. Shakespeare used it. In Othello, a character warns against believing a woman's tears because they're merely crocodile tears, staged and meaningless. In Henry VI, the phrase appears again, shorthand for performed emotion. The weeping predator became one of Europe's favourite moral images. But here's the thing, crocodiles actually do cry, not emotionally, not because they feel bad about eating you, but they genuinely produce visible tears, especially when feeding. Modern research confirms what those medieval travellers actually saw. When a crocodile hauls itself onto land, when it opens its jaws wide, when it begins the violent work of tearing and swallowing, fluid streams from its eyes. The mechanism is completely physical. Jaw movements compress the tear glands. Air forced through sinus passages during feeding squeezes fluid out. The tears lubricate eyes that are exposed to air instead of water. In saltwater species, they help excrete excess salt. It's maintenance and chemistry, not sorrow. This tells us something important about how we interpret animal tears. Those medieval travellers saw what they expected to see. They knew crocodiles killed without mercy. They saw tears. They assumed the tears must mean something, must signify some twisted awareness or hypocritical performance of remorse. They created an entire moral framework around a biological accident. We're still doing it, just in different directions. The truth is that tear production is universal across vertebrates. Mammals, birds, reptiles, they all have lacrimal glands or related structures that produce tear fluid. A 2020 study analysed tears from 65 birds and reptiles, macaws, owls, hawks, caimans, sea turtles. Caimans. The researchers compared them to human tears. What they found was both surprising and completely predictable. The basic composition was remarkably similar. Water, salts, urea, proteins. Comparable electrolyte concentrations. Under a microscope, bird tears and reptile tears and human tears all show that same three-layer structure. Mucus layer against the eye, aqueous layer in the middle, lipid layer on top to prevent evaporation. Evolution doesn't reinvent the wheel. If a biological system works, it gets conserved across millions of years and thousands of species. The tear film is ancient technology. It keeps eyes clear, fights infection, provides nutrients, protects delicate tissue. Every creature with eyes that aren't constantly submerged underwater needs something like it. So they all have it. But there are differences. Caiman tears, for instance, are incredibly long-lasting. These animals can go extended periods without blinking. Their tears are engineered to stay put. Sea turtle tears are thick, viscous, loaded with mucus. They have to resist being washed away by salt water. The core function is the same. The engineering details vary based on environment. None of this, though, tells us anything about emotion. These are maintenance tears, the animal equivalent of your basal tear film, constantly refreshing, constantly protecting. The question isn't whether animals produce tears. Obviously they do. The question is whether they produce emotional tears. Tears triggered by feelings rather than irritation or eye health. And this is where things get complicated. Because people desperately want to believe that animals cry the way we do. You've seen the viral videos, the elephant at a sanctuary standing quietly with fluid streaming down its face, and the caption says she's weeping for her lost calf. The dog reuniting with its owner after weeks apart, eyes wet, and everyone in the comments insists the animal is crying tears of joy. It's deeply compelling. It confirms what we want to believe about our emotional kinship with other species. But veterinarians and biologists will tell you that most of those streaming eyes aren't emotional tears at all. They're eye discharge, glandular secretions, allergies, infections, blocked tear ducts causing overflow. Animals produce fluid from their eyes for a dozen reasons that have nothing to do with feelings. When you see a dog with wet eyes, you're probably seeing a medical issue or normal cleaning function, not sorrow or joy. Starting in the 1980s, researchers began systematically surveying veterinarians, zookeepers, and animal care professionals. Do you see animals cry emotional tears? Do elephants weep when distressed? Do apes produce tears during grief? The answers were consistent. No solid evidence. None. These professionals had spent decades working intimately with animals. They'd seen every kind of emotional distress. Separation, loss, pain, fear. The animals showed obvious signs. Vocalizations, body language, behavioral changes. But emotional tears, the kind that overflow and stream down the face specifically because of feeling, not irritation or illness, they weren't seeing it. The scientific consensus, even now, is that as far as current evidence shows, humans are the only species that regularly produces emotional tears. That qualifier matters, as far as current evidence shows, because there are hints, suggestions, complications, which we'll get to. But the basic pattern holds. You can search the animal kingdom from elephants to whales to our closest primate relatives, and you won't find another species that reliably cries emotional tears. This creates a tension, because we're wired for empathy. When we see an animal in distress, we don't just observe it, we feel it. Mirror neurons fire. We imagine ourselves in that creature's place. And when we see fluid in an animal's eyes, especially an animal we love, a pet, a creature with a face we can read, we see tears. We interpret those tears through our own experience. Of course the dog is crying. Look at his eyes. Of course the elephant is weeping. How could she not be? This is anthropomorphism, the projection of human qualities onto non-human entities. It's not stupidity. It's not ignorance. It's actually a sophisticated cognitive capacity, the ability to model other minds, to imagine inner states. The problem is that imagination can run ahead of evidence. We're so good at seeing human emotion in animal behavior that we sometimes see it when it isn't there, or when something genuinely is happening but it's not the something we think. The crocodile really does produce tears while eating. The medieval travellers weren't hallucinating, but they were wrong about what those tears meant, and we might be making the same kind of mistake, just in reverse. Instead of seeing false grief where there's only mechanical function, we're seeing real grief where there might only be blocked ducts and allergies. Both errors come from the same place, the deep human need to read emotion in the world around us, to find our feelings reflected back. Which makes the question even more interesting. If we really are the only ones who cry emotional tears, if this is genuinely unique to humans, then why? What happened in our evolutionary history that made weeping adaptive, useful, worth keeping? The answer might lie in the one animal that complicates everything, your dog, who's probably sleeping somewhere nearby right now, and whose tears might not be quite as simple as we thought. In 2022, a team of researchers at Asabu University in Japan published something that made headlines around the world. Dogs, they reported, produce significantly more tears when reuniting with their owners after a separation than when meeting familiar non-owners. Not just wet eyes. Measurably more tear volume, captured on standardized Schirmer test strips. The kind of paper strips veterinarians use to diagnose dry eye, pressed against the lower eyelid to absorb and measure tear production. The lead researcher, Takefumi Kikusui, had noticed his own poodle's eyes getting teary after she'd had puppies. It made him wonder, could positive emotions actually trigger tear production in dogs? So his team designed an experiment, 18 pet dogs, separated from their owners for at least 5 hours, then reunited. Tear volume measured before and after. The results were clear. During owner reunions, tear production spiked. When the same dogs met a familiar person who wasn't their owner, no spike. Something about seeing their human again was making dogs produce more tears. But the study didn't stop there. The researchers wanted to understand mechanism. Why would reunion trigger tears? They suspected oxytocin, the so-called bonding hormone, the neurochemical that floods your brain during hugs, during intimate moments, during childbirth and nursing. The same hormone that rises in both dogs and humans when they gaze into each other's eyes, creating that loop of mutual affection that's made the human-dog relationship so successful. So they applied oxytocin solution directly to dogs' eyes. Control drops in one experiment, oxytocin drops in another. The oxytocin increased tear production, not by irritating the eye, but apparently by directly stimulating the lacrimal glands. The hormone that mediates bonding was causing tear secretion, a pharmaceutical increase in tear volume, replicating what seemed to happen naturally during emotional reunion. Then came the clever part. The team showed 74 human participants photographs of dogs. Same dogs, different photos. In some images, the dog's eyes had been moistened with artificial tears to make them look teary. In others, the eyes were dry. Which dogs did people find more appealing? Which dogs made them feel more nurturing, more protective? The dogs with moist eyes won overwhelmingly. People wanted to care for them more. The visible tears, whether natural or artificial, were functioning as a social signal. They were triggering caregiving responses in humans. The media coverage was enormous. Dogs cry tears of joy became the headline. Social media exploded with people sharing videos of their pets' watery eyes, now validated by science. Finally, proof that dogs feel what we feel, that those wet eyes during reunion really are the same as human emotional tears. The study seemed to close the gap between species, to confirm what dog lovers had always believed. Our animals weep when they're happy to see us. Except that's not quite what the study showed. Or rather, it showed something more interesting and more ambiguous than that simple narrative. Yes, tear volume increased during reunion. Yes, oxytocin can stimulate tear production. Yes, humans respond to dogs with moist eyes. But increased tear volume is not the same thing as emotional crying. Not the same as tears streaming down a face. Not the same as the complex social signaling that human emotional tears involve. Canine behavior specialist Clive Wynne was quick to point this out. The Schirmer test strips used in the study are placed against the eye. They can slightly irritate the conjunctiva, potentially causing reactive tearing. The dogs knew the procedure was coming, having been tested before. Stress or anticipation might have contributed, and the oxytocin drops themselves, regardless of their hormonal effect, are still liquid being put in an eye, which naturally stimulates tear production to flush foreign substances. The study's findings were real, but their interpretation required caution. Clinical psychologist Lauren Bilsma, who studies human crying, made a similar point. Humans don't just produce more tears when we cry emotionally. We produce tears that overflow, that stream, that are visible to others from a distance. We vocalize, we sob, we show unmistakable facial expressions. Our crying is a package, an integrated emotional and communicative display. What the dog showed was increased tear volume during an arousing positive experience. That's interesting. That's genuinely new, but it's not crying in the human sense. Still, the study matters, because it suggests something that biologists have suspected for a while. The link between bonding hormones and tear production might be ancient, might be built into mammalian physiology at a deep level. Oxytocin receptors are abundant in lacrimal glands across many mammal species. The basic machinery connecting emotion and tear secretion might have been there for millions of years, sitting in the genomes of countless creatures. What humans did, perhaps, was elaborate it, amplify it, turn a subtle physiological response into a full-blown communicative signal. Think of it as pre-adaptation. Evolution doesn't create new structures from nothing. It tinkers with what's already there, repurposing existing anatomy and chemistry for new functions. Birds didn't invent feathers for flight. Feathers evolved first for insulation, then got co-opted for display, and only later became flight surfaces. Maybe emotional tears are similar. The hormonal connection between bonding and tear secretion was already there, shared across mammals. But in humans, for reasons we're still working out, that connection got amplified until tears became visible, overflow became normal, and crying became a social signal that others could see and respond to from across a clearing. The dog study, in other words, might be showing us a glimpse of the raw material that human emotional crying is built from. Not proof that dogs cry like we do, but evidence that the physiological substrate, the basic hormonal pathway linking attachment emotion to tear gland activity, is older than humanity. We didn't invent it. We intensified it. This is how science actually works. Not dramatic reversals where everything we thought was wrong, but gradual refinement. New data that complicates the picture without overturning it. Yes, humans still appear to be the only species that cries emotional tears in the full communicative sense. But no, we're not operating on completely unique biology. The mechanisms we use have evolutionary precursors, hints and shadows in related species. The gap between us and other animals is real. It's just not as absolute as it looked before 2022. And that means the question remains open, not settled, not closed. The intellectual honesty demands we say this. As far as current evidence shows, emotional crying is uniquely human. But current evidence keeps changing. The sample sizes in the dog study were small. Replication hasn't happened yet. Other species haven't been tested with the same care. We're still early in understanding the neurobiology of tears across the animal kingdom. What feels like a clear dividing line today might look fuzzier tomorrow. The frontier is still open. The answer is still being written. So if the hardware was already there, scattered through mammal genomes like unused circuitry, the real question becomes, why did our ancestors start using it the way we do? To trace that, you have to go back. Not just a few thousand years, not even to the Ice Age hunters and painted caves, deeper, to a night on the African savanna hundreds of thousands of years ago, when your species was not yet your species. Picture a small band of hominins, maybe 20, 30 individuals like those scattered bottleneck survivors we talked about before but farther back in time. A ring of faint firelight in the dark, beyond it tall grass, insects, the distant cough of a big cat. The air is full of smells, smoke, sweat, blood from the day's hunt. Somewhere near the edge of camp an infant wakes. Newborns, then as now, had almost nothing going for them physically. No fur, not much muscle, no ability to cling to a mother's back the way a chimpanzee baby can. Human infants are, by primate standards, absurdly helpless. Heads too big, necks too weak, motor systems unfinished. They can't walk, can't crawl, can barely coordinate their own limbs, but they can cry. The baby's first move is not to crawl towards safety. It's to open its mouth and light up the night with sound. A thin, cutting wail. Rhythmic, rising and falling, structured in ways that modern acoustic analysis shows are strangely consistent across cultures, even across mammalian species. Mammal babies everywhere use sound as their first language. I'm cold, I'm hungry, I'm in pain, I'm alone. This is the part we share with other animals. Kittens mew, wolf pups yelp, monkey infants shriek. Vocal crying is just an acoustic distress signal, and it's ancient. You don't need culture for this. You don't need symbolic language. You need lungs, a larynx, and a nervous system wired to set them off when something's wrong. But somewhere along our lineage, something extra began to happen. Not at birth. Newborn humans usually cry with dry eyes. The lacrimal glands are already working, keeping the cornea moist with basal tears, but not enough to overflow. The wet cheeks we think of when we imagine crying, those don't typically show up immediately. Modern pediatric sources put the onset of visible, streaming tears somewhere between about 2 weeks and 2 months of age. There's variation, but the pattern is clear. First comes the voice. Only later comes the visible water. Now imagine that same savannah camp a few weeks further on. The infant is a little older, its nervous system a little more coordinated, the pathways between limbic brain regions, autonomic nerves, and tear glands a little more responsive. Something startles it. Maybe a sudden shout. Maybe the shadow of a hyena flickering beyond the fire. The baby's face screws up, breath catches, and the wail rises again, raw, insistent. But this time, if you were close enough to see in the firelight, you might notice a new detail. Fluid welling at the corners of the eyes. Not just moistening, but gathering, then spilling down over fat, open cheeks. This is where the story becomes speculative. We don't have fossils of tears. We can't date the first crying baby whose eyes visibly overflowed in sadness or fear. What evolutionary theorists do instead is what we've been doing with the bottleneck story all along. They take what we know now about infant development, about hormones, about how people respond to tears, and run the tape backwards. One idea that's gained traction has a simple name, the helpless infant theory. It starts from something uncontroversial. Human babies are unusually dependent for unusually long, 9 months in the womb, then years before they can feed, defend, or even reliably move themselves. And unlike most great apes, where mothers do almost all the work, our ancestors seem to have evolved what anthropologists call cooperative breeding, shared childcare, alloparenting. In many traditional societies studied today, a baby might be carried, nursed, fed, and soothed by grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, unrelated clan members. The mother is central, but she's not alone. This kind of system has big advantages. It lets mothers forage, it spreads risk if someone falls ill, but it also creates a problem. If your survival depends not just on one caregiver, but on a shifting network of them, how do you keep all of them engaged? How do you get not just your mother's attention, but the attention of whoever happens to be nearby when you're cold, hungry, or in danger? Sound travels far, but it's also blunt. A wail in the night says distress, but not much else. It reaches your mother, but it also reaches predators and rival groups. It carries through the grass whether someone is 2 meters away or 200. Helpful, but crude. A visible tear, by contrast, is local. It's a close-range signal. You have to be near enough to see the shine on the cheek, the glistening eye. You have to be facing the infant. In a cooperative breeding primate that is intensely visual, that reads faces for mood, attention and intention, this extra layer of information could matter. Attachment theorists who study how infants and caregivers bond have long emphasized that babies are not just blobs of need. They're active social strategists. Their smiles, their eye contact, their cries all shape adult behavior. It's possible, some researchers argue, that the appearance of highly visible, overflowing tears on an infant's face added a new piece to that toolkit, a kind of visual underline beneath the already urgent sound. Modern experiments with adults back this up indirectly. Show people a face that looks sad, then digitally remove the tears, and the emotion becomes ambiguous, maybe tired, maybe skeptical, maybe just thinking. Add the tears back in and watch how judgments shift. Sadness becomes clearer, threat drops, perceived need rises. People feel more inclined to help, to trust, to comfort. Take that lab finding and put it back in the savannah camp. An infant whose eyes visibly fill and overflow during distress may tug just a bit more powerfully at the nervous systems of those around. Not only at the mother, whose brain and body are already tuned to that baby, but at the adolescent sister, the unrelated male, the grandmother from another lineage. Extra motivation to pick up, to rock, to feed, to protect. The helpless infant theory suggests that this extra visual signal didn't appear first in grieving adults at funerals or lovers in arguments. It began with babies, with evolution adding a bright, wet exclamation mark to the existing acoustic cry. But why would such a signal stay honest? If tears are so good at pulling caregiving out of others, wouldn't there be an advantage in faking them? In crying wolf, in a literal sense? Here's where another idea comes in. Costly signalling. For a signal to remain reliable over evolutionary time, it often has to be expensive or risky to produce. A peacock's tail makes him more visible to predators. A roaring stag advertises its presence to rivals. Precisely because these displays come with costs, they can't be maintained by weak, low-quality individuals. They stay useful as cues. Emotional tears might belong in that family. When you cry hard enough for your eyes to overflow, your vision blurs. The world goes soft at the edges. It gets harder to run, to fight, to track threats. Your facial muscles slacken. Your breathing becomes irregular. Your voice cracks into sobs. You look, in a word, disarmed. From the standpoint of a hungry carnivore or a violent rival, this is not the time to pick a fight. From the standpoint of someone trying to cheat, someone pretending to be in deep distress while secretly ready to pounce, full-on tears are not a great strategy. They undercut your ability to act on the deception. That's the essence of the honest signal hypothesis. Emotional tears may work partly because they're tied into a physiological cascade that is genuinely hard to turn on and off at will, that makes you a little less capable in the moment. When your ancestors cried, they were not just telling the group, "I'm in trouble" or "I'm no threat." Their nervous systems were committing them to that posture, at least briefly, by physically lowering their guard. Recent work even adds a chemical twist. In one set of experiments, men who sniffed women's emotional tears, not knowing what they were smelling, showed reductions in aggressive responses in lab tasks. Tear chemicals, at least in that context, seem to damp down hostility. If something similar operates in infants, a crying baby's tears might have been doing double duty, visually attracting help while chemically softening the aggression of adults around them. Put all that together, hyper-helpless babies, cooperative breeding, visual brains, costly signals that reduce threat, and you get a plausible pathway. First, vocal cry as universal mammal alarm. Then, in our lineage, the amplification of tear glands' response to distress, especially in the early months of life, until visible overflow became a normal part of intense infant crying. Those wet cheeks, in turn, helped lock in and stabilize a caregiving style, where many adults, not just one, routinely responded. Once that system existed, it didn't have to stay confined to infancy. Human development is full of traits that start with babies and then get co-opted by adults. High-pitched, sing-song parentese speech that originally calmed infants becomes the basis for lullabies and ritual chants. Play behaviors that train young brains in social rules grow into adult sports, theatre, and games. Emotional tears may have followed the same path, a signal that evolved first to say, "Help, I am small and vulnerable and I need you," gradually extended into older childhood, into adolescence, into adulthood, now carrying additional meanings, not just physical need, but social pain, remorse, reconciliation, awe. The nervous system that linked strong emotion to the eyes in a 3-month-old did not suddenly shut off at puberty. It elaborated, rewired, layered itself onto language and culture. By the time your more recent ancestors were burying their dead with grave goods, composing myths, and navigating complex alliances, the infant template for crying may already have been millions of years old. Every adult tear in this view would be an echo of that original helpless call. A grown body briefly borrowing the body language of a baby to say, in effect, "Right now, I need you to treat me as fragile, to pause your aggression, to come closer instead of turning away." We can't prove this story the way we can date a stone tool or sequence an ancient genome. But when you take the pieces we do know, developmental timelines, cooperative child rearing, the social effects of visible tears, it fits together with an almost uncomfortable neatness. And it sets up the next puzzle. If tears began as a baby's SOS, how did they become something more ambitious? Not just a way to pull individual caregivers in, but a way to hold entire communities together, to soften conflict, repair trust, and stitch groups of strangers into moral worlds. For that, we have to move from the cradle to the campfire, from crying as a survival hack for infants to crying as social glue for everyone. Imagine that same campfire, but the baby is no longer the centre of the scene. It's 20 years later. The helpless infant has become a young adult. They can walk, hunt, argue, fall in love. They have scars now, memories, alliances and grudges. The world of their emotions is not just hunger and cold anymore, but betrayal, jealousy, pride, grief, relief. The tier system, though, is still the one they were born with. Evolution rarely invents from scratch. It reuses. It takes whatever already works for one job and nudges it into another. So if visible tears were already good at pulling caregivers toward a baby, the next step in the story is simple but profound. What happens when that same signal appears on the face of someone who is not helpless anymore? Picture a dispute in a small, tightly knit band. Food is short. 2 hunters come back with a carcass and argue about how it should be divided. Voices rise, hands clench. In a group of 20 or 30, this isn't abstract politics. It's life or death, not just for the combatants, but for their children, their lovers, their aging parents. In most mammal societies, conflicts like this are settled by dominance. The bigger, stronger, or more aggressive individual wins, the other backs down, and the social order resets around that fact. There are displays, snarls, sometimes injuries. Reconciliation, when it happens, is mostly about physical proximity, grooming, play, submissive posture. But our ancestors were drifting toward a different kind of society, one where hunting large animals required coordination, where plant knowledge, tool skill and memory mattered as much as raw muscle, where survival hinged on keeping the same few dozen people working together across years, even after bitter arguments. In that kind of world, you need more than dominance. You need repair. Now imagine one of the disputants' faces suddenly change. The jaw slackens. The eyes redden and shine. Tears start to gather, then spill. In that moment, all the machinery that once made adults rush to a crying infant kicks in again, but now directed at a peer. The visual signal that said, "I am helpless, care for me," is being repurposed to say, "I am overwhelmed. I am not attacking. I am asking you to stop." Modern experiments hint at how powerful that cue can be. When researchers show people photos of faces, then digitally add or remove a single detail, the tear track glistening down the cheek, everything changes. The same face, with no tear, might be read as annoyed, aloof, maybe just tired. Add a tear and observers consistently rate it as much sadder, much more in need of help and far less threatening. Even when the exposure is so brief that participants barely know what they saw, the tear speeds up their recognition of distress and increases their reported urge to comfort. The liquid itself is doing social work. Take that finding out of the lab and back to the fireside. Inside a small group where everyone's survival depends on each other, a signal that flips a rival's perception from enemy to wounded allies has enormous value. Early theorists put it bluntly. Emotional tears might have evolved as an appeasement display, because they blur vision, because they mess with your breathing, because they twist your face into something soft and open. They honestly advertise that you're not in fighting form. They say, through muscle and moisture, "I submit. I can't see clearly. I'm not about to attack you." In small, interdependent bands, turning a potentially lethal fight into a tense reconciliation could preserve not just two individuals, but the hunting team, the child care network, the whole fragile meta-population. There's even a hint that the chemistry of tears might reinforce this message. One study had men unknowingly sniff samples of women's emotional tears. Afterward, in lab tasks meant to measure aggression and competitiveness, their responses were dampened. Their brains, on scans, showed reduced activity in regions linked to anger. It's early work and it needs replication, but it fits the broader picture. Tears might broadcast vulnerability visually, while also, at close range, quietly nudging others' nervous systems away from violence. If that's even partly right, then adult crying isn't just a private overflow of feeling, it's a social technology. And once you have it, you can do more than stop fights. You can hold people together. Think about grief. In a world where infant mortality was high, where infections could take someone overnight, where a broken leg could be a death sentence, bands of hominins would have been constantly brushing against loss. A child dies. A skilled forager is killed in a fall. The group gathers. Bodies lean in. Someone starts to make a low, keening sound. Others join. Eyes redden. Tears fall. From the outside, that scene is heartbreaking. From an evolutionary angle, it's also functional. When modern participants read stories or see videos of someone crying versus someone struggling not to cry, they report feeling more socially connected to the crier, more willing to sit with them, to offer help, to forgive a past slight. Analyses of those studies suggest a key pathway. Tears heighten perceptions of helplessness and shared emotion, which in turn increase prosocial responses. In small ancestral bands, that loop could knit people tighter each time they faced a shared blow. Public tears became a way of saying, "I am with you in this. Your loss is my loss. Our world has changed, but the group is still here." They transform a private ache inside one skull into something visible that others can mirror and respond to. The same system could work in happier directions too. Joyful tears are harder to explain if you think of crying as just distress leaking out. But if you see tears as a signal that says, "An emotion here is overwhelming, and I want you to feel it with me," then it makes more sense. Relief at a hunter returning alive from a dangerous trek, or at a meteor storm, the birth of a child after many failed pregnancies. In these moments, the body is sending the same old infant message. Flooded, overloaded, please come closer. But now the content of that overload can be gratitude, wonder, triumph. Tears turn inner peaks and valleys into something the group can see and join. They synchronize feelings. One person's eyes shine, then several, then many. Before long, you have not just individual joy, but collective elation, bonded to a shared memory. This is what some researchers mean when they talk about tears as social glue. They help coordinate emotional states across a group. They make it easier for people to infer what others are going through, not just from the shape of a frown or a smile, but from the extra emphasis of moisture. In controlled experiments, a neutral face with tears is judged almost as sad as a prototypically sad face without tears. In real life, that means subtle, ambiguous states. Quiet despair, muted shame, can still register clearly to others. Hidden pain becomes harder to miss. In a species leaning ever more heavily on cooperation, on food sharing, child sharing, knowledge sharing, that kind of transparency is gold. It lets problems surface earlier. It lets apologies land more deeply. It lets gratitude and admiration spread instead of trapping them inside one person. And all of this was unfolding alongside other channels of communication. Our ancestors were not just silently weeping statues. They had postures, slumped shoulders, open palms, bowed heads. They had facial expressions, the triangular sad mouth, the knitted eyebrows of confusion, the wide-eyed stare of fear. They had vocal tones, the quaver in a voice, the sudden drop to a whisper, the rise to a shout. Eventually they had words. Language, when it arrived in full complexity, didn't replace those older systems. It layered on top of them. A person could now say, "I am sorry. I am afraid. I am so happy you're alive." But tears gave those words weight. A tearful apology versus a dry-eyed one does not feel the same, even today. A storyteller whose eyes glitter when describing an ancestor's heroic death pulls an audience in more than one whose face never changes. Seen from this angle, emotional tears look less like an odd glitch in human design and more like one strand in a braided rope. Facial expression, body language, vocal tone, and later, language. All woven together, all refined under the same pressures. Tiny groups trying to stay coordinated, to heal rifts, to share knowledge, to survive. As far as current evidence shows, no other animal took the eye moisture channel this far. Many species use posture, sound, and even scent to signal distress and submission. We alone seem to have turned clear liquid on the face into a multi-tool of social life. A way for infants to hook caregivers, for rivals to back down without losing everything, for mourners to pull a community close, for joy to overflow into something shared. Of course, in the modern world, the effects of tears are not always kind. Context and culture matter. A crying child might be comforted in one society and shushed in another. A crying man might be seen as honest in one room and weak in the next. But beneath those shifting norms lies an older, deeper circuitry. Millions of years of brains that, on average, treat wet eyes as a cue to move toward, not away. From here, the story turns inward again. If tears help shape how others behave around us, what are they doing inside our own bodies when they come? Why does a good cry sometimes leave us calmer, lighter, as if something heavy has been drained? To answer that, we have to step from the campfire into the bloodstream and watch what happens chemically when emotion tips over into water. By the time tears actually reach your cheeks, the story is already well underway. It begins deeper in the skull, in a set of structures sometimes called the emotional brain, the limbic system. Something happens, not always something huge. A memory surfaces, a sentence lands wrong. A piece of music hits the same phrase that played at a funeral years ago. Or more simply, the accumulated wear of the day, the small humiliations, the unspoken worries, finally tip some invisible balance. The amygdala is one of the first regions to light up. It's often described as the brain's alarm system, but it's more than just panic buttons. It's a significance detector. Is this thing important? Is it dangerous? Does it matter to me? When the answer is yes, the amygdala talks to the hypothalamus, a tiny but powerful region that sits like a command center between emotion and body. The hypothalamus is plugged into your autonomic nervous system, the circuitry that quietly runs heart rate, breathing, blood pressure, sweating, digestion. It can flip you into fight or flight mode, or ease you back into rest and digest. In emotional crying, as far as current evidence shows, it tends to do both. At first, there's a surge, heartbeat quickens, breathing becomes shallow or catches, muscles tense, sympathetic nerves, the ones that prepare you to act, to run, to shout, get more active. Lab studies that have managed to capture genuine stress-induced crying show clear signs of this arousal phase: elevated heart rate, spikes in sympathetic nerve activity sharper than during ordinary mental stress. On the surface, this looks like the opening moves of a fight or flight response, not a gentle relaxation, but then something odd happens. Instead of channeling that activation into punching or fleeing, the system for many people pivots. The same hypothalamus that helped crank everything up starts to recruit its counterpart, the parasympathetic system, the branch that slows the heart, deepens the breath, and nudges the body toward recovery. Breathing begins to come in those ragged, sighing waves you know from your own crying. The long exhale, the stuttering inhale, the eventual deep, shaky breath. Over minutes, heart rate often drifts downward. Blood pressure edges back. Where the sympathetic system put its foot on the gas, the parasympathetic gently taps the brakes. If the early phase of crying is a storm front, the later phase is the clearing sky. Researchers sometimes describe this as a shift from sympathetic dominance to parasympathetic rebound. The idea is that crying might be one way the body helps itself transition out of a state of unbearable, sustained arousal. The tears are not separate from that process. They're wired into it. Because while all this is going on in your chest and gut, another line is running from the hypothalamus down toward your eyes. Your tear glands, the lacrimal glands, live in the upper outer corners of your eye sockets. They're controlled ultimately by cranial nerves, bundles of fibers that go straight from brainstem to face. For reflex tears, the kind you produce when you get smoke or onion fumes in your eyes, the main pathway is bottom up. Sensory fibers from the irritated eye travel along the trigeminal nerve back into the brainstem, where they trigger a reflex arc that activates parasympathetic fibers of the facial nerve. Those fibers tell the lacrimal gland to start secreting. Emotional tears use a similar final pathway, but the command begins higher. Limbic and cortical areas, amygdala, bits of medial prefrontal cortex, send signals down into those same autonomic nuclei in the brainstem. Instead of "there's pepper in my eye," the message is more abstract. "This situation hurts. Let's do the crying program." From there, the order is carried by parasympathetic branches of the facial nerve to the lacrimal glands, which begin to produce a different kind of fluid than they do during normal lubrication. And this is where the chemistry gets interesting and slippery. In the 1980s, a biochemist named William Frey collected people's tears in little vials. Some were reflex tears, coaxed out by irritants. Others were emotional, triggered by sadness or stress. When he analyzed them, he reported a series of differences. Emotional tears, he said, contained higher levels of certain proteins, of prolactin, a hormone associated with caregiving and stress, of adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, which is involved in the body's response to stress, and of a small peptide called leucinenkephalin, an endorphin-like substance linked to pain modulation. Out of these findings came a story that moved quickly into popular culture. Crying, people said, literally flushes stress hormones out of your body. Emotional tears are a kind of biochemical detox, a way of excreting excess cortisol and ACTH so your internal levels can return to normal. The leucinenkephalin result added a poetic twist. Maybe tears weren't just removing stress chemicals, but delivering their own homegrown anesthetic. Your eyes water, and somewhere your pain gets a chemical buffer. It's a deeply appealing picture. It matches the folk idea of a good cry washing something out. It feels right. But when later researchers went looking for solid, repeatable evidence, the story grew more complicated. Advinger Hoots, one of the leading scientists in crying research, and his colleagues have spent years sifting through these claims. They don't deny that emotional and reflex tears can differ in composition. There are hints of higher protein and hormone content, but they point out a simple quantitative problem. Even if emotional tears do contain stress-related substances, the total volume of tears you produce in an average crying episode is tiny compared to the volume of blood and extracellular fluid in your body. The amount of ACTH or other hormones you could remove by weeping, in this view, is likely too small to meaningfully change your overall levels. From that angle, crying as a detox mechanism doesn't quite add up. The numbers don't favour a major cleansing effect. The leucinenkephalin finding faces similar caveats. It's tantalising to think of an endorphin-like peptide leaving your eyes, hinting at analgesia. But replication has been patchy. Modern techniques haven't consistently confirmed large differences, and if the peptide is there, it may be more a trace marker of the body's general stress state than a sign that the tears themselves are functioning as painkillers. So where does that leave the good cry? If it's not primarily about flushing chemicals out, what is happening when you sob in the dark and later feel, if not happy, at least a little softer inside? Some clues point back to the dynamics of the nervous system we just walked through. The arc from sympathetic surge to parasympathetic rebound, the shift from racing heart and tight throat to long exhales and slower pulse, looks a lot like what your body does after other intense states, like a hard sprint or a panic attack that has crested and begun to ebb. Crying may act as one pathway through that transition. It's a kind of embodied punctuation mark. Something big just happened inside, and now the system is moving toward recovery. But when psychologists actually ask people about recent crying episodes, another pattern jumps out. People don't reliably feel better after crying in every context. They tend to feel better after crying when certain social conditions are met. If you cry and someone you trust responds with warmth, stays with you, listens without shaming, offers touch or quiet understanding, reports of relief and catharsis go up. People describe feeling cleansed, lighter, closer to the person who witnessed their tears. If you cry alone and stay alone, or cry in an environment where you feel judged, trapped, or embarrassed, the aftermath is different. Many people say they feel worse, more raw, more ashamed, more exhausted without the offsetting comfort. In laboratory settings, where participants know they are being observed and often feel constrained, crying episodes are especially unlikely to produce mood improvement. The context is too artificial, too exposed. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. If emotional tears evolved, at least in part as social signals, as a way of pulling others close, of dampening aggression, of eliciting care, then their full effect would depend on that loop being completed. The chemistry inside your own body matters. So does the response outside it. When tears draw in a soothing presence, everything aligns. The parasympathetic system is activating. Stress hormones may be gradually falling for other reasons, and now there is also a hand on your shoulder, a voice saying, "I'm here." The nervous system doesn't just settle in isolation, it co-regulates with another person. When no one comes or when the reaction is harsh, the signal has fired but the expected feedback is missing or negative. The body has done the crying program. The social world has not delivered the matching care. Relief is much harder to find. So the chemistry of a good cry, insofar as we understand it, seems to be a mixture of three intertwined strands. There is the neurobiology, limbic alarm, hypothalamic commands, cranial nerves telling lacrimal glands to pour, autonomic systems swinging from arousal toward rest. There is the fluid itself, a salty cocktail with proteins and hormones and perhaps trace endorphin-like molecules, different enough from reflex tears to be intriguing, not different enough so far to definitively prove a detox or anesthetic function. And there is the social layer, the way tears, once visible, invite or fail to invite comfort from others, and how that response feeds back into heart rate, breathing, and mood. In the end, the mystery of why you sometimes feel so much better after weeping may lie less in the droplets on your cheeks and more in the larger pattern they are part of, a body shifting gears and a primate brain reaching out, however wordlessly, for company. Our ancestors, huddled under animal skins and watching embers fade, felt those shifts without having words for limbic systems or ACTH. They only knew that after the storm of sobbing, there was often a calmer air in the chest, and that sharing tears with others could turn unbearable pain into something held in common. Over time, humans would take that private bodily storm and build around it rituals, songs, and stories, formal ways of crying together. To see how far that went, we have to leave the inside of the skull and return to the long arc of culture, where tears became sacred tools in the oldest ceremonies of grief and memory. Imagine the firelight has changed. We're no longer in a small band on the Pleistocene savanna. The flames are taller now, licking up from cut timber. Around them rise mud brick walls, stone houses, city gates. Grain is stored in jars. Kings carve their names into clay. And when someone dies, the tears have an audience. Picture a street in a Bronze Age city, maybe in Mesopotamia, somewhere along the Euphrates. The air is hot and dusted with chaff from the threshing floors. A small procession moves slowly between the houses. At its centre, carried on a wooden bier, lies the body of a man who mattered to this neighbourhood. A merchant, a scribe, a soldier. Around him, the sound is not quiet sobbing. It is organised noise. Women at the front begin a high, wavering cry that rises and falls like a siren. It isn't random. It has a shape, a pattern they all seem to know. One voice calls out lines about the dead man, his children, his trade, the gods who watched over him, while others answer with a repeated phrase. Between verses, they beat their chests, tear at their hair, press their fingers into their cheeks hard enough to leave marks. The men follow behind, less demonstrative but not dry-eyed. Some cover their faces with their cloaks. Some let tears spill freely. At certain key refrains they join in, adding a lower, rougher chant beneath the women's sharp keening. This is not just grief escaping. This is grief performed. By the time the procession reaches the burial place, the lament has done several jobs at once. It has told the story of the deceased. It has announced the loss to the neighbourhood, calling witnesses. It has given everyone present, even those who barely knew the man, a script for what they are supposed to feel. And crucially, it has told the gods, we are paying attention. We are keeping track of who has gone. When we move a little west in both space and time, to archaic Greece, the pattern becomes even clearer. Greek funerals, as far as surviving texts and images suggest, were built around formal lamentation. There were names for different parts of it. The goose, the raw wail raised by kin at the bedside and around the bier. The threnos, a more structured funeral song that might be performed by specialists, almost like professional mourners. Vase paintings from the geometric period, those early angular figures scratched onto clay, already show the key elements. A body laid out on a platform, at the head and feet, women standing with arms lifted above their hands in their hair. Long fingers tugging, pulling, sometimes shown as if they're tearing strands free. Around them, other figures with arms raised, chests exposed, garments ripped open. Later written sources fill in the sensory details, the rhythmic beating of breasts, the lacerating of cheeks with fingernails, the tearing of clothing, the sound of high-pitched, ululating cries that blended into sung lines about the dead. The alternating voices, one woman leading, others responding, sometimes men interjecting brief phrases of praise or sorrow. For Greek women, especially, lament was not merely allowed, it was expected. It was a social role, handed down in practice and memory. If a relative died and you did not wail, did not weep, did not tear at your hair, you weren't just failing your own heart. You were failing your duty to the dead. Crying in this world had become a kind of sacred labour, and, as with all powerful forms of labour, it had to be managed. Because emotional tearing in a small family circle is one thing. Emotional tearing amplified into collective ritual, scores of people sobbing, shrieking, shaking their bodies in unison around a corpse. That is something else entirely. Athenian lawmakers seem to have noticed. In the 6th century BCE, the reformer Solon famously tried to regulate funerary rites. The fragments we have suggest a very practical concern on the surface. No more tearing of cheeks until they bled. No more wandering from tomb to tomb, professional mourners whipping up sorrow for the sheer intensity of it. Limits on who could attend, how long they could stay, how much noise they could make. Underneath, many historians see a deeper anxiety. Women's laments, with their raw physicality and public visibility, were one of the few sanctioned ways that those without formal political power, wives, mothers, sisters, could criticize, remember, and sometimes indirectly accuse. A lament for a dead son killed in war could slide almost effortlessly into a commentary on the decisions of generals. A lament for a man executed by the state could hold his honour up against the shame of those who condemned him. Collective grief, in other words, could carry political charge. Solon's laws tell us that the city valued tears enough to keep them. Funerals were still loud, still full of weeping, but also feared what might happen if that weeping went unchecked. Too much lament might not just disturb the peace of the tomb, it might disturb the peace of the polis. At the same time, there was a strict gender grammar to all of this. In many early societies, including Greece and the cultures around the ancient Near East, the job of public, noisy, continuous weeping fell primarily to women. They were the ones trained in the poetic formulas, the ones whose bodies enacted the visible signs, torn hair, scratched cheeks, uncovered breasts, that signalled grief to the community and the gods. Men's tears, in contrast, had their own narrow corridors. When a man wept openly, it was supposed to mean something exceptional had happened. Myth and scripture are full of these sanctioned moments. Achilles, the fiercest of the Greek warriors, collapses over the body of Patroclus. He weeps, he clings to the corpse, he smears himself with ash. His tears don't make him weak, they make his loss and his love undeniable. They mark the turning point that will drive him back into battle. In another tradition, the Hebrew Bible tells of King David crying out for his rebellious son Absalom, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom." The text emphasizes that he covers his face and weeps as he walks, a king temporarily stripped of royal composure by paternal grief. His tears do not undermine his authority, they underscore his humanity. These are not everyday tears. They are theatrical in their own way, tied to heroism, sacrifice, or unbearable familial loss. So we see a pattern emerging. Women, permitted, even required, to weep loudly and often in specific ritual contexts. Men, expected to remain controlled in most settings, but allowed explosive, highly charged weeping when the narrative stakes are high enough. The fact that these patterns had to be reinforced by law, by story, by art, suggests another thing too. Everybody, regardless of gender, was capable of crying. Emotional tears were not rare. What was rare, and therefore narratively interesting, was a man crying outside those ritual boundaries. Even the physical traces of ancient mourning hint at how people thought about tears themselves, not just the act of shedding them. Across Hellenistic and Roman graves, archaeologists often find small, narrow-necked glass or ceramic vessels, sometimes spindle-shaped, sometimes with delicate long rims. For a long time, these were popularly called lacrimatories, tear bottles. The story went like this. Mourners would literally catch their tears in these little flasks, saving them as offerings for the dead or as proof of their grief. A widow might show a soldier husband's bottle of tears as evidence of her faithfulness. The more filled bottles in a tomb, the greater the love. Modern scholarship has cooled on this literal interpretation. Chemical residues point to oils and perfumes in many of these vessels, not saline tears. There is, as far as specialists can tell, no clear ancient text that straightforwardly describes people bottling their sobbing. Yet the persistence of the tear bottle idea, in late Roman anecdotes, in medieval sermons, in modern devotional art, tells its own story. People believed tears were the kind of thing you could measure and collect, worthy of being imagined as stored, counted, offered. One biblical psalm even uses the metaphor of a deity keeping a person's tears in a bottle, as if every droplet of sorrow were recorded somewhere beyond human sight. That metaphor only works if you already live in a world where tears are seen as substances of value, not just wastewater, but physical tokens of love, loyalty, pain. So by the time cities rose and laws were codified, the quiet nervous system loop you feel during a modern crying jag had been wrapped in layers of meaning. Tears were signals to kin, to the wider community, to the gods or spirits who watch the rites. They were obligations, part of what you owed your dead, your family, your social role. They were potential hazards, capable in great numbers and in the right mouths of stirring unrest or questioning power. And they were, already, political tools, assigned to some bodies more than others, permitted in some contexts and forbidden in others, constantly negotiated at the boundary between private ache and public order. From the earliest literate civilizations, then, humans were treating emotional tears as something far more than a side effect of a stressed brain. They were treating them as raw material for ritual, law, and story, which brings us back quietly to the larger mystery. If a few milliliters of salty fluid can be turned into sacred obligation, into evidence in a cosmic ledger, into the soundscape of a city's grief, that tells us something about what our species saw in those drops from the beginning. Not just biology, not just individual relief, but a force that binds households, challenges rulers, honors the dead, and says in a way words never fully can, this life mattered. In the next part of the story, those meanings won't stay fixed. As empires rise and fall and religions shift, the rules about who may weep and when will twist again. From medieval monks sobbing over Christ's wounds to Victorian gentlemen training themselves not to flinch. The tears themselves don't change. The scripts we hang around them do. It is no longer just a family duty at the graveside or a political problem for lawmakers. In certain cloisters, under certain vaults of stone, it is treated almost like a supernatural substance. Monks and nuns talk about the donum lacrimarum, the gift of tears. If you open the writings of Gregory the Great in the 6th century, or leaf through later medieval sermons and visions, you find this idea again and again. Some people, when they pray, find themselves overwhelmed. Their bodies shake. Their faces are wet. Tears stream down not for a dead relative, not for personal misfortune, but simply from contemplating God, or their own sins, or the wounds of Christ. And this isn't seen as embarrassing. It is seen as evidence that something has gone right. The logic runs like this. Ordinary people, dulled by habit and distraction, say the words of prayer and feel very little, but a heart that has been truly touched by grace, a heart softened by divine love, will be pierced by compunction. That piercing hurts, but it is a sweet hurt. It breaks open the hardness around the soul. The opening shows up on the body as tears. Medieval authors divide these tears into lower and higher kinds. Lower, more common tears of repentance, when you're suddenly appalled at your own cruelty or pride. Higher, rarer tears of yearning when you weep simply because you long for God and feel, for a moment, the distance between earth and heaven. Hagiographies, those long affectionate biographies of saints, pile on examples. Holy women whose veils were perpetually damp from weeping during Mass. Hermits who could not speak Christ's name without choking up. Ignatius of Loyola, later in the early modern period, writing in his spiritual journal that he sobbed so often at the thought of divine mercy that a physician worried about his eyesight. This is not a world where real men don't cry. It is a world where some of the most respected men cry a lot, as long as they are crying for the right reason. A knight might be expected to keep his composure in battle, but a monk in his cell was almost supposed to dissolve. In that narrow space, tears were not a loss of control. They were a mark of advancement, a sign that God had drawn especially near. But as always, when tears gain value, suspicion follows close behind. Some spiritual directors warn their readers to be careful. Not every wet eye is a holy eye. You can cry from wounded pride, from fear of punishment, or even from wanting to look devout in front of others. There are already worries, even here, about performance. By the time the medieval world tips into what we call the Renaissance and early modern period, that suspicion has a potent new metaphor: the crocodile. For a long time around the Mediterranean, people told stories that crocodiles lured victims by making sounds like a weeping child, or that they shed tears while devouring their prey. Ancient naturalists repeated versions of this. Whether anyone had actually watched enough crocodiles to be sure is doubtful, but the image stuck. In the 16th century, the humanist Erasmus gathers classical sayings into his adages. Among them, to weep crocodile tears. He glosses it as feigned grief, the show of sorrow when the heart feels none. From there, the phrase seeps into vernacular languages. English playwrights find it irresistible. By the time Shakespeare is putting words in the mouths of kings and villains, crocodile tears has become a handy insult. Now, if a ruler weeps over a subject he has condemned, if a lover cries repentance after repeated betrayals, an audience is licensed to ask, are those tears real? Or are they part of the act? The same fluid that once proved divine grace in a chapel now, on stage and in essays, can prove hypocrisy. Notice what is happening here. Emotional tears have become so recognized, so expected, that writers can build elaborate double meanings around them. At one pole, the saint in his cell, rocked by unbidden sobs. At the other, the schemer at court, squeezing out a shiny drop at the perfect political moment. By the 18th century, this tension between sincerity and spectacle surges into a new fashion, the culture of sensibility. In Enlightenment Europe, especially Britain and France, a certain ideal of the man of feeling takes hold. He is educated. He reads poetry and moral philosophy. He is attentive to the sufferings of others, and crucially, he is moved to tears by them. Sentimental novels and plays are explicitly designed as tear engines. A book like Henry Mackenzie's The Man of Feeling, published in 1771, follows a protagonist whose heart is constantly stirred by scenes of poverty, injustice, and tender love. Readers are meant to cry with him. Theatre audiences go to sentimental comedies not just to laugh, but to sob at reunions, reconciliations, and noble sacrifices. Far from being mocked, this visible weeping is praised. It shows that your nerves are fine-tuned, your moral sense delicate. Tears become proof of refined character, of a sensibility too generous to remain dry-eyed in the face of pain. This ideal is not limited to women. Men in salons and drawing rooms may pass handkerchiefs around without shame when a particularly affecting scene is read aloud. To be completely tearless in such a setting can even mark you as coarse, unfeeling, dangerously hard. For a brief historical moment, the rules bend. Public male crying, in certain cultured spaces, is not weakness but fashion. Then, within a few decades, those rules twist again. Across the 19th century, especially in Britain as it rises as an imperial power, a different model of manhood begins to crystallize: the stiff upper lip. The phrase itself turns up first in American print in the early 1800s, but by late Victorian times it has become shorthand for a certain British ideal: the ability to face danger, loss, and discomfort without visible emotion. This new script has not come out of nowhere. It draws on older Stoic philosophies and on Protestant emphasis on self-control, but it is sharpened by new conditions. Industrialization brings regiments of workers into factories, mines, railways, places where long hours and bodily risk are daily realities. The ideal worker is punctual, disciplined, reliable under pressure. Tears, like other overt displays of distress, are seen as disruptive, unproductive. At the same time, the British Empire is stretching across continents. Its officers and administrators are educated in elite public schools where boys are trained, often quite brutally, not to cry. Floggings, cold baths, hazing rituals, all presented as forging character. A boy who weeps is shamed. A boy who takes it like a man is praised. Those boys grow up to run colonial administrations, to lead regiments, to stand at the edges of maps holding lines that, in their view, separate civilized from savage. Within that worldview, visible emotional restraint becomes part of what marks them as fit to rule. Literature and popular culture reinforce the image. By the time Rudyard Kipling writes the poem If, in 1910, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs, the figure of the unflappable, dry-eyed gentleman has hardened into an ideal. Tears are relegated to private spaces, to rare eruptions at funerals, to the inner rooms of the home. Again, this is not an absolute prohibition. Historians who pore over diaries and letters find plenty of Victorian men describing moments of weeping. Public mourning rituals for monarchs or national tragedies can still be awash in tears, but the lines are sharper now. A factory foreman is not supposed to break down in front of his crew. A colonel is not supposed to weep in the trench. A statesman announcing bad news may pause, throat tight, but must master himself for the cameras and caricaturists. War reinforces this still further. In the mass carnage of the First and Second World Wars, soldiers who keep silent about their terror and grief are celebrated. Those whose nerves crack, who sob, shake, dissociate, are diagnosed with shell shock, later combat fatigue, often met with incomprehension or contempt. The same pattern holds on the home front. Women weeping on the platform as trains carry sons away to the front are an accepted, even expected part of the scene. Men stand behind them, jaws clenched. We can trace a direct line from this 19th and early 20th century discipline to many of the norms that still hover in the background of modern Western life. The idea that boys should man up rather than cry. The suspicion that a male politician's tears are either manipulative or disqualifying. The quiet permission that still clings more easily to women's sobbing than to men's. All of this is relatively recent. It is not encoded in our biology. It is the residue of factories and empires, of schoolyards and barracks. And while psychology today increasingly finds that chronic emotional suppression can exact a cost in stress, in cardiovascular strain, in difficulty forming close bonds, the older scripts are not easily shrugged off. They are written into family stories, workplace cultures, national myths. So across this long arc, from the monk in his cell welcoming the gift of tears, to the 18th century gentleman dabbing his eyes at sentimental play, to the Victorian officer biting his lip until it almost bleeds, we see the same basic human capacity being bent into very different shapes. The tear duct does what it has always done. The nervous system surges and releases as it always has. What changes is the answer to a deceptively simple question. Who, in this place and time, is allowed to let those drops be seen? In the next part of the story, we'll zoom in on that question in the present, on how gender, culture, and psychology weave together to decide who cries more, who cries where, and what those tears are allowed to mean. If you ask people openly and without judgment, how often do you cry? The answers fall into a pattern. Not perfectly, not in every country, but clear enough that psychologists can graph it. Across large surveys, dozens of nations, tens of thousands of people, women, on average, report crying more often than men. Something like this. For many women, 30 to 60 crying episodes a year. For many men, closer to 6 to 17. Women also talk about crying in fuller waves, with sobbing and audible weeping. Men more often describe eyes filling and then pulling back. Before puberty, that difference largely disappears. Little boys and little girls cry at similar rates. The gap only opens as adolescence hits, which hints that biology is doing something, but not everything. If you zoom in to the hormonal level, a few suspects emerge. One is prolactin, a hormone most famous for its role in breastfeeding, but also linked to stress and, intriguingly, found in emotional tears. By late adolescence, women, on average, have substantially higher circulating prolactin than men. Early experiments by William Frey and others claim that emotional tears contain more prolactin and other stress-related molecules than simple reflex tears. If that work is even partly right, and some of it has been hard to replicate, it suggests a crude story. More prolactin in the body might mean an easier trip to tears. Anatomists have also proposed that there are subtle, sex-linked differences in the lacrimal glands themselves, and that testosterone may act as a kind of brake on tear production, while estrogen and prolactin may ease it. But when researchers look more closely, the simple hormonal story starts to fray. People with very high prolactin levels because of medical conditions do not necessarily weep constantly. Moderate changes in hormones alone can't predict who will cry at a given moment. Even the menstrual cycle, a place you might expect clean, rhythmic changes, offers a murky picture. Some women do report being more tearful at certain points in their cycle. Others do not notice much difference at all. Controlled studies find trends but not iron laws. So biology sets a background. It tunes the instrument. It may make some bodies a little more tear-ready than others. But it does not write the music. Culture does most of that. Think back to those Victorian schoolyards and military academies where boys were punished for crying. Now run that script forward into a modern living room. A 2-year-old boy falls, scrapes his knee, and bursts into tears. In one household, he is scooped up, soothed, told, "It's okay to cry, that looked like it really hurt." In another, he hears, "Come on, big boys don't cry," or "Shake it off, you're fine." A girl in the same situation is more likely, on average across many societies, to be comforted rather than shamed, to have her tears interpreted as understandable rather than excessive. Multiply that by thousands of small moments, from playgrounds to sports teams to locker rooms, and you get a powerful pattern of learning. Boys discover that each visible tear risks social cost, mockery, punishment, withdrawal. Girls discover that tears within limits can bring closeness, concern, and permission to show vulnerability. Over time, these lessons sink deeper than conscious rules. They get into what psychologists call display rules, silent expectations about which emotions are allowed out of the body and which must be kept in. When Advingerholtz and colleagues compare countries, they find something telling. The gender gap in crying is not fixed. It stretches and shrinks depending on local norms. In some wealthy, individualistic nations that pride themselves on emotional expressiveness, both men and women cry more overall, and women cry a lot more than men. In countries with stricter emotional codes and sharper gender role expectations, everyone reports less crying, and the difference between men and women is smaller. At first glance, that might seem odd. Shouldn't more gender equality mean less of a gap? But what these studies often pick up is not legal equality, but how acceptable it is to show emotion in public. Where the culture says, feel things, share them, talk about them, women seem to lean into that invitation more readily, because they already have centuries of social permission behind them. Men may move a bit, but they still run up against a lingering wall of real men don't cry. And there is another twist. The way men cry is watched more closely. In many Western and Northern European societies, a man who weeps at a funeral for his child is given room. A man who chokes up briefly at a national tragedy can even be praised for his humanity. But a man who cries openly at work, or during a minor quarrel, or because he feels overwhelmed, may still trigger discomfort, suspicion, even contempt. The old scripts have softened, but they have not disappeared. Yet those scripts are not universal. In other regions, the map of allowed tears looks different. In parts of the Middle East, for example, public male weeping in religious contexts can still be a mark of devotion. In certain Shia Muslim rituals of mourning, men and women alike may sob loudly for the martyrdoms of the past, beating their chests, the tear-streaked face becoming a sign of piety. In South Asian traditions, too, male tears in specific settings, funerals, religious festivals, public laments for communal losses, are far from taboo. A respected elder crying as he recites poetry of separation from God or grief for a dead relative may deepen his authority rather than undermine it. Here the line is not between men cry and women cry, but between this is a holy or tragic time and this is ordinary life. Tears in the first zone are collectively sanctioned for everyone. Tears in the second remain more regulated. Step back and you can see the same basic dynamic we trace through history playing out in the present. Cultures decide when tears are meaningful and when they are misplaced, who they beautify and who they embarrass. And alongside these social rules runs another current, what tears feel like from the inside. Folk wisdom offers a simple promise, have a good cry and you'll feel better. Psychologists have tried to test this. They ask people to keep diaries of crying episodes, or bring them into labs, show them sad films, let the tears come, and then track their mood. The results are not as straightforward as the proverb. Many people do report feeling relieved after crying, but not always right away. Sometimes the immediate aftermath feels raw, exposed, exhausted. The uplift, when it comes, can be delayed by minutes or hours. More importantly, Whether crying helps depends heavily on context. If you cry in a place where you feel safe and someone responds with warmth, listens, holds you, sits quietly nearby, the odds of later feeling better go up. If you cry and are mocked, ignored or punished, the odds go down. Crying because you have processed a loss is different from crying because you have just been humiliated in public. Researchers like Vingerhoots find that when you factor in these details, the reason for crying, the presence or absence of comfort, the person's own beliefs about whether crying is shameful or acceptable, the idea of catharsis becomes less a universal law and more a possibility. Tears can be cleansing, they can also be draining. The same cascade of autonomic shifts that, in one setting, helps the body reset, in another setting just leaves you wrung out. This complexity becomes even clearer when you look at mental health. It would be easy to assume that crying a lot always equals worse off, and not crying equals strong and stable. But the clinical picture is almost the reverse. In mild to moderate depression or anxiety, people often cry more. Their emotional thresholds are lower. Small slights or sad thoughts can tip them into tears. But in more severe, long-lasting depression or deep burnout, the ability to cry can actually vanish. Patients sometimes say, "I want to cry and I can't." They feel like the tears are locked behind glass. This emotional numbing, an absence of tears where you might expect them, is one of the markers clinicians watch for. It can mean the nervous system is so overtaxed that it has shut down expressive routes altogether. Medications can blur the picture further. Certain antidepressants, especially those that flatten emotional highs and lows, can reduce crying. For some people, this is a relief. For others, it feels alien, as if a vital channel has been damped. From this angle, you can see how misleading our stereotypes are. A man who rarely cries may be stoic and well-regulated. He may also be someone who's never been allowed to feel safe enough to let go, or someone slipping into a kind of quiet, tearless despair. A woman who cries easily may be fragile. She may also be someone whose emotional system is responsive and well-integrated, who trusts her relationships enough to show distress. The tear count alone tells you very little. The story around the tears, the culture, the gender scripts, the context, the inner landscape, tells you much more. So when we say that women cry more than men, we are saying something true in the narrow sense of survey averages, but incomplete in every other way. We are measuring not just glands and hormones, but centuries of training. Not just sadness, but whether sadness is allowed a visible form. And all of this, the biology, the socialization, the particular psychology of each person, now has to navigate a new arena altogether. An arena where tears can be photographed, replayed, slowed down, turned into icons. In the next part of the story, those same old drops of salt water move onto screens and into text messages, into viral videos and tiny yellow faces as human beings learn to cry and to represent crying in the digital age. If you want a measure of how strange our relationship to crying has become, you don't have to look at a funeral or a therapy session or a late-night argument. You can look at your keyboard. For most of the last decade, the single most used emoji on Earth has been a tiny yellow face tilted back, eyes squeezed shut, blue droplets flying from both corners, face with tears of joy. At its peak, around 2015, it accounted for close to a fifth of all emoji use in some English-speaking countries. In later years, according to the Unicode Consortium, the people who standardized these symbols, it was still responsible for more than 5% of every emoji sent worldwide. Billions upon billions of times every year, people tap out a stylized version of laughing until you cry. More recently, younger users have drifted toward the loudly crying face or even the skull to mean, "I'm laughing so hard I'm dead." But the basic point holds. We've taken one of the most intimate, bodily, vulnerable acts a human can perform, filling our eyes with fluid until the world blurs, and turned it into a cartoon icon we can fire off dozens of times a day without a second thought. Your Paleolithic ancestors used tears as a high-stakes social signal, visible only at arm's length, in the firelight, on a real face you could touch. You use them as punctuation. LOL might not feel enough, so you add tears. This doesn't mean our feelings have become fake, but it does mean that the repertoire of crying has expanded. There is the wet kind that runs down your cheeks, and the dry kind made of pixels and shorthand that performs a version of crying without any moisture at all. And then there is the crying that sits in between, the tears you shed in front of a camera. Because along with emojis came something else, platforms. Places where anyone can broadcast their face and their tears to an audience not of 20 or 30 clan members, but of hundreds, thousands, sometimes millions of strangers. Scroll through a video feed and you'll see it. Confession clips recorded with swollen eyes and flushed skin, reaction videos where influencers watch devastating news stories, or moving reunions and cry on camera with their followers. Apology videos where a public figure's tearful statement is replayed, frame by frame for sincerity or manipulation. On some platforms, or as just crying on TikTok is practically its own genre. People hit record in the middle of a breakup or a panic attack or after a long day at work. They weep, they talk, they wipe their faces. Comments pour in. Comfort, criticism, accusations of attention-seeking, messages from people who say they feel less alone. Sometimes the tears genuine and impulsive, a person overwhelmed and reaching instinctively for the nearest form of connection, which happens to be a front-facing camera. Sometimes they're clearly staged, thumbnail images chosen for maximum redness and glistening eyes, captions that highlight the crying as a hook, and sometimes it's not tears at all, but the simulation of tears. Augmented reality filters can now lay a glossy, wet-eyed, trembling expression over any face, regardless of what the person actually feels. One viral filter gave every user drooping brows, quivering lips, and glassy, tear-rimmed eyes. People used it to film themselves laughing, dancing, telling jokes. The visual language of crying, downturned mouth, shiny eyeballs, a hint of wet streaks, became a kind of mask, worn for fun. Your nervous system still knows what real crying costs. Your social world has discovered that the appearance of crying can be detached from that cost and used, recycled, shared. The same thing has happened to animals. Earlier we talked about the scientific debate. As far as current evidence shows, humans are the only species that produces tears directly tied to emotional states, even though many mammals, birds, and reptiles generate tears for eye health or salt balance. Veterinarians and ethologists, when surveyed, generally report that they don't see clear, repeatable cases of animals weeping from sadness the way we do. But your video feed tells a different story. A dog sits by the door as a soldier returns from deployment, eyes shining conspicuously as it whines and presses its head into the person's chest. An elephant in a rescue sanctuary appears to have tears tracking down its face as it is freed from chains. A cow being led away from her calf seems to weep on camera. These clips spread fast. The algorithms that run big platforms are tuned to notice what grabs and holds attention. And few things grab human attention as strongly as a familiar, powerful social signal, a crying face. So the system learns, show more of that. A single video of a weeping elephant that might once have been a story told in one village is now watched by tens of millions of people across continents. Shared with captions like, "Animals cry just like us," it reinforces a belief that science still treats very cautiously. Could some of these animals be experiencing complex emotions? Quite possibly. Could their eyes be watering from dust, irritation, or normal lubrication rather than grief? Also, very possibly. Without controlled observation and careful measurement, there is no way to know from a single clip. But your brain, tuned by a lifetime in a species where tears almost always mean something emotional, fills in the gap automatically. You see tracks of moisture, you see a posture that looks forlorn, and the story writes itself. In this way, digital networks don't just carry our beliefs about tears, they magnify them. They multiply certain images, certain interpretations, until they feel self-evident. And this amplification doesn't stop at animals, it loops back onto us. Because when tears become content, viewers start asking an old question with new intensity. Are those tears real? People slow down video footage of a public figure's apology, looking to see whether tears actually fall, or whether the eyes merely glisten. They debate whether someone's crying on camera is an authentic breakdown, a calculated move to win sympathy, or a performance for clicks. There is something almost medieval about it. In earlier centuries, moralists and storytellers used the phrase crocodile tears to accuse someone of faked sorrow. The image came from a myth that crocodiles wept while consuming their prey, a bizarre combination of predation and insincere mourning. Today, that same suspicion has been given high-definition tools. Freeze frames, reaction videos, detailed breakdowns. Was that pause too long? Did the person check the camera? Did they stop crying once they thought they were off-screen? The anxious line between genuine grief and opportunistic display drawn thousands of years ago now glows under the harsh light of online scrutiny. And yet, the very fact that we scrutinize so hard tells you something. If tears were trivial, nobody would care. There would be no point in faking them, no reason to doubt them, no arguments in comment sections about whether someone is weaponizing vulnerability. The intensity of the response, sympathy, contempt, protectiveness, rage, reveals that emotional tears remain one of the most potent social signals we have. Think about what happens when you see an actual crying face in person. Most people feel at least a flicker of urge to soothe, to turn away, to fix, to retreat. Very few remain completely indifferent. Online, that same reflex is still there, but it is filtered through layers of distance, anonymity, and performance. A tearful confession video can summon real compassion from strangers. It can also trigger accusations of manipulation or mockery, precisely because the viewer knows at some level that cameras change behavior. The crying person is not just in pain. They're also choosing to display that pain, to frame it, to share it. In that choice lies both risk and reward. The reward, connection, validation, sometimes money and fame. The risk, being labeled dramatic, attention-seeking, insincere, having your most vulnerable moments replayed, remixed, detached from the context in which they were first shed. The old village rules, who gets to cry, where and when, have not disappeared. They have simply shifted. Now, instead of a tight circle of neighbours, you face an invisible crowd with its own shifting norms, its own hunger for authenticity and spectacle. Underneath all of this, the emojis, the filters, the viral animals, the debates about real and fake, something constant is still at work. Those salty drops are still broadcasting the same basic message they carried around Paleolithic campfires. I am overwhelmed. I am in need. I am no threat. Come closer, or at least please do not hit me. Modern technology has extended their reach and complicated their meanings, but it has not emptied them of power. If anything, the way they dominate our icon sets, our feeds, our arguments suggest the opposite. Out of all the things we might have chosen as our favourite digital faces, we pick the ones that laugh so hard they cry, or cry so hard they soak the screen. It is as if, even in text and pixels, We cannot tell a story about ourselves without reaching for water in the eyes. In the end, this brings us back to the central puzzle of the whole journey we've been on. Why did a primate lineage evolve the habit of leaking fluid from its eyes when its heart is moved? Why did those leaks become signals that can bind a group together, split a community apart, invite care, provoke scorn, and now travel around the planet in seconds? To answer that, we have to pull together everything we've seen. The helpless infant, the social glue, the chemistry, the rituals, the gendered rules, the emojis. We have to ask not just how tears work, but why. From an evolutionary, social, and deeply human point of view, they matter so much. That is where we go next. So, after all of this, the biology, the history, the emojis, and the ancient laments, you might be hoping for a single, clean answer. We cry emotional tears because... and then one simple sentence that ties everything in a bow. But when you ask the people who've spent their careers studying this, they don't give you that kind of answer. They say things like biopsychosocial phenomenon. They say it's probably many things at once. They say the data can support several overlapping stories. They say, in other words, that your tears refuse to sit still inside one neat box. And that might be the most fitting answer of all. Because the whole point of emotional crying is that it's messy. On your face, in your chest, in your life. It blurs lines between inside and outside, between body and society, between what is happening to you and what is happening between you and someone else. Still, if we pull gently on all the threads we've followed, some strands do come together. One strong strand is signalling. From an evolutionary point of view, emotional tears look very much like an honest social signal. They are costly. They blur your vision, redden your skin, tense your throat, shake your breath. They make you less able to fight, to run, to keep your expression controlled. When you cry in front of someone, you are quite literally disarming yourself. Experiments back this up in small but telling ways. Show people a neutral or slightly sad face on a screen, then add digitally drawn tears to the exact same face. Suddenly observers see more sadness, more need, less threat. They are quicker to recognize that help might be required, more inclined, in hypothetical questions at least, to say they would comfort and support. This salt water doesn't just fall, it speaks. In a world of small bands and fragile alliances, that speaking mattered. A tear-streaked face in the firelight was a way to broadcast, I am overwhelmed. I am not dangerous. I need you. Think of a conflict within a group. Toes stepped on, insults thrown, resources contested. A defiant stare keeps the tension alive. A tearful gaze, especially when combined with a softening voice, can flip the script from confrontation to reconciliation. In that sense, tears are like a white flag you wave with your own body. So one answer to why do we cry is because evolution discovered that leaking water from the eyes is an efficient way to modulate other people's behavior, to lower aggression, to pull in caretakers, to mark certain moments as serious, sacred, or in need of attention. But that's only one layer. A second strong strand is attachment. Across mammals, babies are noisy. Separated from their caregivers, they call, squeal, scream. Those calls tug at adult nervous systems, compelling them to approach and soothe. Human infants do this too. But somewhere along our lineage, something extra seems to have been added. Visible, glistening tears. Why? One idea is that as our ancestors became more visually oriented, more cooperative, and more reliant on long-term bonds, a visible signal layered on top of sound became especially useful. A helpless baby with a wet face, a grieving parent with a wet face, a partner pleading not to be abandoned, eyes overflowing. Those are not just generic distress displays. They are magnetic fields for attention. Study crying in real life, and you see how tightly it's woven into relationships. People report crying most often not in total solitude but in connection with others. Arguments, reconciliations, funerals, breakups, weddings, reunions. And when crying leads to comfort, a hand on the shoulder, a soft word, someone simply staying by your side, it's more likely to be remembered later as relieving, even healing. This fits with what we know of the chemistry, although that part of the story is still very much in progress. Emotional tears, when analysed, seem to contain different mixes of proteins and stress-related substances than simple onion tears. Prolactin, ACTH, certain endorphin-like molecules show up at higher levels in at least some studies. People often report feeling calmer after a good cry, as if something has shifted inside the body as well as in the room. No one can yet say exactly how much of that change is biochemical detox and how much is the social response, the hug, the listening, the loosening of pressure. Most likely it's both. Your lacrimal glands, your hormones, your vagus nerve, your amygdala, and the people sitting next to you are all part of one big feedback loop. Which brings us to a third strand, self-regulation. Even if the old claim that we cry out toxins turns out to be exaggerated, there is reasonably good evidence that crying is one way your nervous system tries to reset. You feel tension building, emotion rising, all the things you've tried to hold in threatening to spill over. Then, at some point, the spill happens. Breathing becomes uneven, eyes flood, muscles soften. Afterwards, in the right context, there can be a kind of slackening. The parasympathetic system, the rest and digest arm of your physiology, seems to step back in. You may feel empty, tired, but also a little more spacious inside your chest. So, if we have to summarize, we might say, humans cry emotional tears because over hundreds of thousands of years, those tears became a multi-tool, a way to send honest signals, a way to bind fragile attachments, and quite possibly a way to help the body ride out and rebalance intense states. Not three separate functions, but three sides of the same shimmering drop, and under all three lies the same foundation. We are a deeply, almost absurdly social species. Your ancestors didn't survive because they were the strongest solitary hunters. They survived because they formed bands, shared food, traded knowledge, helped with each other's children, and learned painfully how to live close together without tearing each other apart. In that world, any adaptation that helped communicate need, reduce violence, increase trust, and stabilize relationships would be favored again and again. Seen from that angle, emotional tears are not a curious side effect. They are one of the clearest signatures of what we are. Highly social apes whose survival depended on reading each other's faces with exquisite precision and letting their own faces be read. Now, what about that uniqueness claim, the one this whole story started with? As far as scientists can currently tell, no other species routinely produces tears specifically in response to emotion the way we do. When veterinarians and field biologists go looking, they find plenty of tearing for eye health, or to flush out irritants, or manage salt. They hear distress calls and see postures of grief or fear, but they do not see over and over again what a human would call weeping. And yet, the closer we look at other animals, the less comfortable that absolute line becomes. Dogs, for instance, share homes and daily lives with us. In one recent study, when dogs were reunited with their owners after a separation, their tear volume went up. Oxytocin, the bonding hormone that also floods human systems during cuddling, nursing, and close contact, seemed to be involved. Does that mean dogs cry tears of joy like we do? Not necessarily. The sample was small, the mechanism unclear, the behaviour subtle. Most experts are cautious. Still, it hints that the building blocks of emotional tearing,